What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the second episode of the Warrior for Life show. I guess we'll call it a show. Today, we're going to be talking about a book called The Forgotten Highlander, and that's by Alistair Urquhart. Just an announcement before we begin. All these books are going to be available on the Warrior Soul Fitness website, the www.warriorsoulfitness.com. I created a bookstore, and basically it has all the books I've read in the last 2 or 3 months, and it'll have every book that we talk about here. So if you want to grab one of those books, they'll be available there on the website, and I'll have all of them listed out. And that's about it. Today, the book we're going to be talking about is really intense. The Forgotten Highlander it's an autobiography of a British soldier who was captured while he was staying in Singapore by the Japanese as they invaded during World War II. He got sent to Thailand to work in labor camps, camps that were building a railroad. And one of the projects he worked on was a bridge over the River Kwai, just like the movie. But unlike the movie, which really sanitized the way in which the prisoners were treated by the Japanese, these guys went through hell. Unspeakable acts of cruelty, unspeakable crimes against humanity, and horrible living conditions. For Alistair Urquhart was there for 6 years of his life, and I could not imagine going through what he went through from the age of 18 all the way up to the age of 24 and not being bitter. But this guy comes out of this ordeal and he lives. He has a successful business career, and he's still alive today, living in his 90s. He actually just wrote the book a couple of years ago after his wife passed, because he didn't want his wife to know exactly what he went through. So the big thing about this book, I could say, is once I finished reading it, I told myself there's really nothing that I could ever go through that could compare to this, and hopefully there's nothing that I will ever go through that would compare to this, and hopefully nothing that you guys will ever go through that would compare to this. And so I told myself there's nothing I can ever complain about again. Um, Life is beautiful for most of us, and life was beautiful for him as well, but it really, I think, took a lot of this ordeal to give him some of the perspective he has. So the big lesson here is going to be for you to look at your own tough ordeals, see what you can derive for them, and see how you can overcome and gain some perspective on yours. I'm going to read some passages from this book, and we'll talk a little bit at the end about more lessons you can get from this. This passage happens already after he's been captured and he's in the camp for a few months, and he's talking about a few of the Japanese guards. Sorry, my hair looks plastered to my head. From an early period, the Japanese camp commandant, whom I called the Black Prince, became ever more inventive with his punishments. I could not imagine a more sadistic and evil person on the planet. The more heinous the so-called crime, the sicker the sentence. Under his instructions, the guards had free rein. If they felt you deserved something more than a beating, it meant taking you aside and making you pick up a large boulder. For the rest of the day, you had to hold a rock over your head in the blazing heat. Within minutes, your already weak and malnourished arm muscles would start to twitch and fail you. Before long, you'd have to drop the rock, usually the size of a rugby ball or football, mindful you did so without letting it fall on your own skull. When you let go, the guards would pounce, fists, rifle butts, and boots flailing into your body until you picked the rock up again. It would go on all day. And if the Japanese officer did not think you had learned your lesson sufficiently. The punishment would be repeated back at camp. The Black Prince was a true bastard. Others called him the Kanyu Kid, but I thought my name suited Lieutenant Usuki really well. He was darker than the other Japanese soldiers and strutted around like royalty, his beefy gut protruding from beneath the shabby uniform. He despised us totally. We were scum to him. His absolute power over us and capacity for pitiless brutality made him so terrifying to me. Long before our decision to incarcerate crazy men, the Japanese had built their own cages, the black holes as they were known. So prior to this, some of the prisoners were going out of their mind and they were attacking other prisoners. So the prisoners asked the Japanese if they could build cages of sorts to house the people who were losing their minds so they didn't attack other prisoners. And then the Japanese had their own kind of cages that they put people in, but this is what they were like. Long before a decision to incarcerate crazy men, the Japanese had built their own cages. The black holes, as they were known, were a higher form of punishment. Those unfortunate enough to be locked inside the semi-subterranean cages, proportioned so you could not stand, lie down, or even kneel fully, would be kept in for a month typically. Corrugated iron and metal covered the bamboo to intensify the heat, deprive the victim of air and any cooling breeze. Few who went in came out alive. The Black Prince's right-hand man was Sergeant Seiichi Okada, known to the Brits simply as Dr. Death. Short and squat, he took the roll calls and carried out all the camp commandant's orders. Presumably, he was more educated than the other Japanese or Koreans, but he was evil to the marrow. Ruthless in the extreme, he loved tormenting us. He especially reveled in a sickening brand of water torture. He had the guards pin down his hapless victims before pouring gallons of water down the prisoner's throat using a bucket and a hose. The man's stomach would swell up from the huge volumes of water. Okada would then jump up and down gleefully on this prisoner's stomach. Sometimes guards tied barbed wire around the poor soul's stomach. Some men died and few survived. I witnessed this disgusting display only once, but it was once too often. Dr. Death also took great delight in hurling stones and rocks down on prisoners from a lofty vantage point. When a prisoner was caught stealing from the Japanese officer's storeroom, or if a man turned on a guard, they received the next grade on the sliding scale of Japanese torture. I called it the Indian rope trick, one favored by Indians in the old cowboy films. The helpless prisoner would be tethered, spread eagle to the ground. They wrapped wet rattan, the same string-like bark used to lash our bamboo huts together, around his ankles and wrists, and tied him to stakes in the ground. As the rattan dried, the ties would slowly gash into the skin, drawing blood and tearing into sinew and cartilage as it pulled limbs from their sockets. It reduced even the toughest man to agonizing screaming, and they would be there all day. I would be almost glad to get out of camp in the mornings just to avoid hearing their cries of unbridled pain. It was a way of torturing all of us. Often, when we returned from the day on the railway, the men would no longer be there. Nobody asked where they'd vanished to. I certainly did not want to know. After such a horrific ordeal at the end of the Japanese, death at the end of a Japanese bayonet would have been welcomed. So they're now working on the railway, and you have to remember one thing about these guys is that they weren't getting any food. They were maybe getting a handful of fermented rice that was about to go bad every day or that had already gone bad. They were getting minimal water. They were living amongst sewage, shit everywhere. They were basically shitting out in the swamp. There was mosquitoes everywhere. Half of them had diphtheria or malaria, and they were already weakened by the ailments. And on top of that, they had to deal with constant torture and beatings from the Japanese. And so we're at a point now where he's working on the railway and his socks disintegrate. It says, Within the first few months, my trusty army boots that had done me so proud since being issued back at the Bridge of Dawn barracks finally succumbed to the rigors of the railway. As I negotiated a slope with 2 baskets filled with rocks on my shoulders, the sole came away from the rubber, sending me head over heels down the hill, rocks bouncing out of the baskets and crashing on top of me. I shielded my head with my arms. When I dusted myself off, I saw that both my boots had split in 2. Many of the men were already going barefoot, and it was something I'd long feared. I tried to repair the boots by lashing them together with a piece of rattan, but it did not last. My socks had disintegrated long before in the tropical sweat. Now, in bare feet, I had the new challenge. My feet were extremely soft from living in constantly wet boots, and the ground was particularly unforgiving, the jagged volcanic rocks often hiding just below the surface of the topsoil. I knew that the soles would harden up, but until then, I would have to walk like a cripple. When using the spade, I wouldn't be able to use my foot to dig deeper in the soil and would require more upper body strength. Having no boots also made the ever-frequent trips to the bagnios, the latrines, ever more unsavory. They were revolting, vast open pits, later covered in after weakened prisoners began to collapse into them and drown. As you approached the bagnios, you had to wade through the mud layered with excrement of those dysentery sufferers who had never quite made it. Flies and maggots swarmed around and wriggled over this foul mush. It got so bad that we had a bucket of water at the entrance to our hut to wash our feet in. It all added to the misery. So on top of everything else, now his boots have disintegrated and he has to walk around this place barefoot, tearing his feet apart and opening himself up to different types of infections. Throughout the book, you also hear about these sores he has on his legs called tropical ulcers, and they get infected in the story. And he's basically trying to stave off infection the entire time. So he resorts to grabbing maggots and putting them on the sores to eat out the dead flesh. And he goes through this for years until finally the Japanese decide to move him and the other prisoners out of Thailand into another place. So they bring them on this long trek and they put him into the ship. And the thing about the Japanese, when they were transporting prisoners via ship, International Geneva Convention basically says that you're supposed to put a red cross on prison ships so that POWs are not getting hit. The Japanese didn't do that because they really didn't care about the prisoners. So they stuffed them into the cargo hold of a ship to the point where there were hundreds of them and they couldn't even move. And at certain points in the story, you're listening about this guy dealing with this cargo hold, but you also realize that any sense of camaraderie between the prisoners gets broken down, and it starts to become every man for himself. So the fact was, these guys were getting dehydrated and starving to death in the bottom of their ship. And so they resorted to cutting each other open and drinking each other's blood, resorting to cannibalism and vampirism. And people were basically all starting to lose their minds until there's a U.S. submarine. And because the prison ship doesn't have a red cross on it, the U.S. submarine thinks that this is a Japanese ship. And so it shoots the ship with a torpedo, and the ship starts to go down. Astonishingly, Alistair Urquhart gets out of the ship, he makes it to the surface, and though hundreds of prisoners were rescued by the same U.S. submarine that took the ship down, Alistair unluckily gets captured again by the Japanese. And so he again has to deal with this torture for a couple of more years. And the thing is, it keeps going. I mean, it's one thing right after the other. And just as soon as you think it's not going to get any worse for this guy, it does. It gets a lot worse. Um, but eventually, he gets moved to a camp near Nagasaki. And one day he's outside and he's doing his work because it was his job to tend to the gardens at that camp. All of a sudden, he feels a heat blast and he didn't really think anything of it. And so he goes back in and he learns that the Japanese are surrendering, and then that heat blast was the blast from Nagasaki. So it wasn't close enough to the nuclear blast to be killed by it, but he was close enough to feel the heat. And so it keeps going. Eventually, they get rescued, but it takes months. They're told by British government to stay put and not to move out of the prison camp. Um, they're basically ordered to do that. And he gets home, and well, first he comes to the United States where he's greeted like a hero, and eventually he gets home to Britain, and there is no greeting, there is no welcome. Nobody is taking care of these guys when they get back. And I just want to read you his note at the beginning of the book. It says, "My time as a prisoner of the Japanese helped shape and determine my path in life just as much as my childhood did. Like it or not, the horrors did happen to me and thousands of others. Yet some good has come out of it. My ordeal has made me a much more patient, caring person. Inspired by the devotion of our hard-pressed medics on the death railway, I was able to care for my young daughter when she was ill, and for my late wife, who required 24-hour attention in the last stages of her life. While in Japan and working with my friend Dr. Matheson, I vowed to spend the rest of my life helping others, and I am pleased to say that I have done so. It is where my satisfaction comes from nowadays. I have tried to use my experiences in a positive fashion and have adopted a motto from them, which I will never tire of telling others. There is no such word as can't. I have not allowed my life to be blighted by bitterness. At 90 years of age, I have lived a long life and continue to live it to the fullest. I enjoyed a long marriage to my wife, and I have been fortunate enough to have a family and enjoy their success. I have amazed my doctors, my friends, my family, and myself by remaining fit and still enjoying my passion for ballroom dancing. I have found companionship too, with Helen, my dancing partner. We run tea dances together and help and support each other. I keep myself alert by painting and teaching my fellow senior citizens how to use the internet. I am grateful for my present way of life after all the turmoil that life has thrown at me, and thankful to have retained my sense of humor. Most importantly, I now visit schools to tell pupils of what really happened in the Far East during those terrible war years. In my 91st year, I am fortunate enough, despite the best efforts of the Japanese Imperial Army, to have a vim and vigor required to tell a new generation of how we suffered. Scandalously, our sufferings, which have haunted all of us Far East prisoners of war throughout our lives, were only recognized by the British government in the year 2000, when it offered compensation of £10,000 to um, the remaining survivors. Unbelievably, the British taxpayer had to pay out that paltry sum, not the culpable Japanese government. I hope that this book will stand as an indictment of the criminal regime that ran Japan during the war years and the failure of successive Japanese governments to face up to their crimes. But I hope too that it will be inspirational and offer hope to those who suffer adversity in their daily lives, especially in these difficult times. Life is worth living, and no matter what it throws at you, it is important to keep your eyes on the prize of the happiness that will come. Even when the death railway reduced us to little more than animals, humanity, in the shape of our saintly medical officers, triumphed over barbarism. Remember, while it always seems darkest before the dawn, perseverance pays off, and the good times will return. May health and happiness be yours. Alistair Urquhart. So again, we come back to that concept of resilience. And while this guy probably could have gone insane, while he probably could have let his bitterness get the best of him, this is a guy who grew from his experience, who became a better person because of his experiences. And this is a lesson we could all learn. Most of us don't have, I don't think there's any of us who would be listening to me right now who have anything that could compare to anything like that. And when you read this book, which you really should, you'll see that there's much more than what I've discussed. And that's why it's so important to read stories like this, because it gives you a perspective. Because in your own life, in a lot of ways, you have tunnel vision, and you have a baseline for what is good and what is bad. You have a baseline for what's hard and what's easy. And in order to truly understand what human beings are capable of on both spectrums, you really have to change your frame of reference by seeing and listening to the stories of those who've gone through much worse and come out the other side better people. So that's all I got for today. I will put the link for this book down in the description box, along with the link for the new bookstore. And as always, if any of you have any questions about this book or anything else, just hit me up. All right, I'll talk to y'all later.